welcome to a very special Friday edition of Literarily Wasted. We have a very special guest. This is the moment you've been waiting for. Are you excited?
I'm so excited.
Yes.
We are Christy and Adam, as the title says below. I'm Adam. She's Christy.
I'm Lucas.
And I'm Talia.
And if this is your first time joining us, this is a Literarily Wasted book club. The book club you can enjoy in your pajamas, which I am currently in. But we have a very special guest, and I think we should just go ahead and get right to it. This is best-selling author of the Magicians trilogy, introducing Mr. Lev Grossman. There he is.
Yay!
Thank you so much for joining us. Yes, and perfect. You have your beverage already.
Yes.
I do. I have it. Here it is.
Well,
cheers to you, sir. Thank you.
The first cue in the Q&A.
Oh, yeah. Cheers. Okay, all right. Cheers. Digital.
Hey, high fives. The first cue in the Q&A. What are you drinking?
It's a little bit of vodka and some soda water and some lime. Just classic, straight up the middle. You know.
Nice.
Yeah, nothing
keeping
fancy.
it neat.
A little lemon in there as
It gets
well.
the job done.
Some adult Sprite.
Well, shall we jump right into the Q&A? Because we got a bunch of people watching. We want to make sure that we get to everybody's comments, and I think we'll kick it off with a few questions. Who wants to start with their question?
Well, Adam, you're already talking.
Oh, well,
so
all right. Let me pull out my questions then, because I wrote them down. Okay, so I'm sure that we're going to have a lot of aspiring writers, some creative people in the audience, and as creative people ourselves, this is something that we deal with a lot. And you mentioned this before we started this Q&A about criticism, and this is kind of a weird place to start, but it's the first question I have on my phone list. So when people do respond negatively or give bad criticism, like they go into the comment section, they say not your best work, which is what we get a lot.
Oh my gosh.
How do you deal with that? How do you respond to that?
It's definitely challenging. It's sort of, I think it's almost an under-remarked on aspect of being a writer in this particular century. It never before have writers been writing, in this sort of headwind of constant feedback that comes at them. It used to be you would write a novel and then it would be published, and then maybe like 2 months later you'd get a couple of letters. Now you hear from absolutely everybody all the time. If you're on Twitter, which I'm on too much, there's always things coming over the transom. And you do get a little bit buffeted by it, and I find it challenging. I used to see a psychiatrist, and one thing I would do in my sessions, I would read my 1-star reviews out loud, and we would just try to sit with the pain that brought me. I think he enjoyed it. It is challenging, and you have to sort of toughen up a little bit, and you also have to take things from it, because there is real, actual, useful information. You want to know when you write something what happens on the other side when people read it. So you try to take it in, but not be just completely blown off course by it, both by the negative stuff and the positive stuff. It's tempting to do fan service, and it's tempting also to throw your laptop in the bin and never ever write again, ever. And both those extremes are sort of too much.
All right, well, thank you for that answer. That's good stuff to think about. And then for the aspiring writers and for me, maybe it is good advice to go see somebody and just be like, somebody said this about our stuff.
Take it to heart, Adam.
Read it out
and
loud.
I think it's just as a word of caution to our viewers on Facebook and YouTube. We are only talking about book 1 of the Magicians thus far, so we don't want to spoil the story for anybody past this point. We would say no spoilers past this point, right?
Yes, no spoilers past that point.
All right, somebody is unhappy.
Or they're very happy.
Sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
This is live. It's bedtime.
Hey, so Lev, you were in Brooklyn, New York with your family, and you were safe, most importantly, correct?
Yes, thank goodness. We are all healthy.
Good.
Excellent.
Well, we are very grateful again. So I've got a question. This is a light question. Adam started with the big heavy ones, but Julie Turner Wheeler wants to know: are you as talented a mixologist as Elliot?
I'm really not. I'm really not. As my current beverage. I mean, Elliot wouldn't touch this. He wouldn't he wouldn't brush his teeth with it. But uh, no, Elliot is an aspirational figure for me in many ways, and his mixology is definitely one of them. I feel as though I appreciate a good cocktail, but I rarely go to the trouble of making myself one.
So expand on that a little bit. Like, what do you mean by he's an inspirational character? Is that kind of like a part of your personality that you wish came out more, or having only read the first book, I haven't seen the total picture of the character.
Oh yeah, I mean all the characters are in different ways. They're kind of alternate selves that you kind of wish that you could inhabit. Janet, I think most of all for me. But yeah, Elliot definitely. He's very funny and witty, and he wears his heart on his sleeve. I have known people like him, and I've made my peace with not actually being like that myself. But I'm definitely drawn to people like that.
I guess that was kind of ties into one of my questions, is that how many people do you have in your real life that have almost a direct correlation to some of these characters? How many of these traits did you actually take from someone or you care about, or maybe someone you don't care about, and kind of transpose it into someone you wrote about?
Non-zero. That is a non-zero number of people who got directly translated into the Magicians. One wants to be cautious about connecting the dots there.
We don't need names.
Yeah. But yeah, it's some of them are I think are genuinely fabricated out of whole cloth. But then others, Elliot, for example, has a lot to do with one of my roommates in college. But he's also drawn from Sebastian Flight and Brides That Are Visited. I mean, real people and other fictional characters, feed very directly into characters, kind of equally much. Elliot's based partly on the young John Lennon. I'm a slightly Beatles fanatic, and I've read some biographies of Lennon, and that character that he was very raw, funny, troubled guy as a teenager. I think that fed into Elliot too.
Awesome.
On Facebook, Timothy Deere asked, how did you develop the magical system of the books? He loved how academic it was.
Yeah, everybody wants to do a magic system. I feel like everybody feels in their bones that they know how magic works. And when they read a book that has magic in it, like, you're thinking, okay, they got that right, but that wrong. Like, I always felt that when I was reading a fantasy novel that I recognized some things people did, but I thought, no, I would do it differently. And so, one of the reasons I wrote it was to get, this sort of private sense of how magic ought to be kind of off my chest. And it was very academic. I tried to, chart a course between, for example, the magic of the Potterverse. I'm a big Harry Potter fan, but there's something almost too domesticated sometimes about Harry Potter's magic. You think, should magic really be something that you could teach to kids in a classroom, or should it be kind of wilder and more dangerous than that? And then the other extreme is sort of Tolkien magic, which is very sort of wild, and there's no real rules laid out. And Gandalf didn't go to wizard school. Gandalf is just a wizard. He's not even human. I don't even know what he is. But that he's got it. That's part of who he is. And I sort of tried to. Probably the magic of Earthsea was a model in the way that magic behaves in this kind of language-like way. Oddly enough. Here, I'll as you can do the cello cam. There's the cellos. I was an ardent but not very successful cellist as a young man, and definitely some of the rigors of learning a musical instrument went into it as well. So a lot of stuff feeds into it. There's some in-jokes for cellists in the book.
Is that kind of where you got the hands, in terms of, in bowing and everything? Because we did have that. Justin Schwartz asked, hooray, Lev, just curious, what was the music on the stand in the background?
That's
So
my
it's
twin
the-
brother, by the way. My twin brother.
Who is a musician?
That is Suzuki Cello Book 1. I'm very proud to say that my son is on the very last page of it. So we're really pulling for him to get to Suzuki Book number 2. I didn't do Suzuki as a kid. I don't know why. But that's what that is. I am, yes, forcing my son to play the same instrument that I play. Because I guess that's what you do when you're a parent.
Yeah, as she looks guiltily over at the baby grand piano that her children
don't play.
won't play. Yes, that's fine.
We got a ton of questions coming in
we
on
got a
Facebook,
ton of
so
questions.
we try to get to as many as we can.
Let's just bust them out.
Well, here's one from Julie Turner Wheeler. She says, why is it necessary to be damaged to be a magician?
That's a really good question. Wow, no one's pulling punches tonight.
And that is something we discussed quite a bit when we were discussing the first half of the book. It was something I think we were all really intrigued by.
It was something that when I wrote it, it was something that I felt rather than thought through. I had this, powerful sense that the only people who would feel the necessary compulsion and sort of masochism to flog themselves through the discipline of magic were people who were really propelled by a mixture of longing and craving and self-hatred and compulsive behavior. I just didn't think it was a thing that mentally healthy people would do. And it felt as though, magic is a metaphor for a lot of things. It's a metaphor for addiction. It's a metaphor for depression. It's a metaphor for artistic creation. All things I've had various experiences with. And where does that come from? Where does that come from in you? And it's funny. I think this is something on which my thinking has evolved. I wrote The Magicians really in the throes of treatment for depression, and it's interesting because then I wrote 2 other books, and by the time I was writing Magician's Land, I had 10 years of therapy and some powerful drugs, and I didn't feel depressed in the way that I had before. And you start to see, I don't think this is a spoiler, you start to see some experiments with what a happy magician would look like. If you were a happy person, if you were a mentally healthy person, is there still magic for you? Is there still a way? Does it come from somewhere for you? And I began to experiment with the idea that was possible. When I say there's that passage where Fogg says, magic comes from pain, and I remember writing that, and it was originally said it was part of the narration. It was just it was not in quotes. Nobody said it. It was just there as narration. And I remember taking that and I put it in quotes and I put it in Fogg's mouth just in case I wanted to deny it later. I was just, that's Fogg. That's crazy Fogg. He's just talking. So, maybe it's true for everybody, or maybe it was just true for Fogg. I don't know. I think it's something I'm still thinking about.
So thank you. And our book club members, everyone saying thank you for being so open and honest with this answer. And it actually ties back, since you've brought up the trilogy, I did have a question about that once again, without revealing any spoilers. It's interesting to hear you talk about what your writing process was, because for me, I got the distinct impression, especially about halfway through the 3rd book, where I thought, did you plan this entire thing out beforehand? Did you have the divine grand plan ready? Because all 3 books, from the beginning of the 1st to the end of the 3rd, seem so intentionally and perfectly woven together into one story. And how much of that was intentional?
I truly wish that I could say that any of it was intentional. When I wrote The Magicians, it was actually as a one-off. I didn't intend to write a trilogy, and it was only in the very late stages, while Magicians was actually being published, then I sort of thought, wait, I didn't finish the story at all. There's all this stuff that needs to happen to these characters still. And then I planned out and wrote the second one. I wrote it again as if there didn't necessarily have to be a third one. And then I felt as though I needed to write a third one. But it went in stages. It's funny. I think that the structure of the trilogy was buried there in the first one. But I didn't see it. I didn't dig down that far until really after it was published, and I started thinking about how to advance the story. It ended up fitting together pretty well. There are things that there are things I would not have written in the first book if I had realized that I was going to write two more. But so it goes.
Yeah.
I never.
Sorry, Evelyn Rogers asks, when did you first? What was the first scene you ever wrote for the Magicians?
There's definitely an answer for that, which is the scene. It's the scene where the beast intrudes into the classroom, and I tell the story, and it doesn't sound plausible, but I'm just going to say it anyway. I wrote that scene long before the rest of the book. I wrote it in 1996, and I was a grad student, and I had been rereading the Earthsea books and thinking about how much I loved the scenes that were set on Roke in the School for Magic. And I read them as a kid, and I kind of thinking back, remembered like most of the book happening on Roke. It's only like a chapter and a half that happens on Roke. And I thought, God, it would be so cool to write a whole book that was set in a School for Magic. I should fucking do that one day. And then I was like, it's crazy talk. This was 1996, and then the Harry Potter books came out. But I had written that one scene, which came from a nightmare that I had after reading the Earthsea books. And it was the thing where you wake up and you write it down. And then I put it away. But later, when I came back to it, that was the sort of the seed of the crystal. And then everything kind of formed around it. And I wrote backwards to the beginning, and then I wrote forwards to the end.
Wow, that's amazing.
So a correlated question with that scene, then Michael Thaxton on Facebook's asking, was your initial description of the beast inspired by the Son of Man painting?
I'm sure it was. And it was not something I was aware of at the time. For some reason, I was very fascinated by the idea of the image of somebody whose face was occluded in this strange way. And then much later, obviously, that must have been kicking around in my mind. But it wasn't conscious, but now I realize it must have come from that, at least in part.
Cool.
Oh, here's a big one. Christy Dishman, I hope I said that right, says, how did you go about juxtaposing the occasional absurdity of the series with the earnestness that you and Quentin obviously seem to feel towards storytelling? Were you ever worried about coming across cynical? And how did you balance those different tones?
Oh gosh.
I told you it was a big one.
Did I balance them? It was very important to me that there be humor in the books. It was so important to me. In some ways, the books were. I didn't feel as though there was enough humor in fantasy, and I felt this was a reaction to what I felt was a sort of, I don't know, I just felt like I'd read a lot of earnest fantasy, and I wanted some funny fantasy, and I wanted there to be funny people in it. And yet, at the same time, there is this central figure, Quentin, who is very earnest, and he can not stop taking things seriously, starting number one with his own feelings, which he takes very seriously, much too seriously. And I don't know if I balanced them, but that sense of juxtaposed, not clashing, but kind of contrasting sensibilities. I feel like that's part of what's exciting to me about novels, their ability to contain multitudes in that way. I hope that I balance them, and that when you get sick of one, then the other one starts happening, and it brings you back.
Nice. Let's see. Sorry, digging through. We're getting lots of really fantastic questions.
This is not as big as the last one. What What was the meaning behind the Tempest quote before the beginning of book 1, says Alexa Wilson on YouTube?
I always loved that quote. It's Shakespeare. It's incredibly brilliant. Of course, everybody loves it. And it's about renouncing magic. And renouncing and there's a moment where Quentin does renounce magic late in the book. And in the Tempest, Prospero, unless I'm completely wrong, does renounce magic, and he goes back to the life of a Muggle. And I don't think Shakespeare called it that, but
he probably wrote it down at some point, right? He probably written it.
And so it strikes that note of renouncing magic, and then the book tries to move past that. I was very, I've always been very preoccupied with Narnia, and especially the way in which. I'm sorry, I'm having a little cleavage here. I'm gonna.
Our viewers are loving it. We're getting likes and hearts galore, so keep it going.
I really wish I could have said it.
Give us more.
I'm obviously really obsessed with the Chronicles of Narnia, and love them, but it always bothered me the way that you kind of lost contact with Narnia when you grew up and became a grown-up and a sexual being, and that was the end for you. And I was really preoccupied with this idea. Also, as a depressed person, the idea that there had to be some magic to being an adult. There had to be some way to be a grown-up and also to have magic in your life. And I guess it was very powerful for me, this question of renouncing magic and what it means and whether you had to.
That's a good. Here's a quick one. Who would win a one-on-one? This is Kim Buscemi on Facebook. Who would win a one-on-one between Alice and Janet?
Does Janet have a gun?
Never.
Which I loved, by the way. I love that she brought a gun to the distillery.
If Janet is strapped, then it's game over. And also, if things get physical, if it's a magic duel, if it's a magic duel, I just don't think that Janet's gonna. I think Janet gets the silver medal in that one. But if there's room for fisticuffs, if there are weapons in the arena, you got to give it to Janet. And again, no spoilers, but third book Janet, I think she becomes a pretty tough customer.
Cool. That's exciting.
Janet is amazing. This is so difficult. It's fine.
Find a question.
Okay, I got one that scrolled away, but I'm going to try to remember the gist of it. What made you decide to develop so many characters in the Magicians? They also specified that they love them all, by the way, but they were wondering what made you decide to include so many characters.
I've always loved ensemble novels. There is one powerful influence on the books was The Secret History by Donna Tartt. And I once met Donna Tartt at a party, and I could not look her in the eye because I thought, oh God, I stole so much from this woman's book. I can't face you, Donna, but look at me. It was awkward. Didn't say any of that, I don't think. I always loved that feeling of being in a circle, in a circle of friends. And it's funny, I had that in high school and a little bit in college, and I never really have had that as an adult, and I missed it so much, that feeling of being in a circle of friends where everybody knows each other super, super well, and sometimes you hate each other and you fight, but you're all just, like this kind of chosen family. It's not something I've had so much in my life as a grown-up, but I miss it so much, and sometimes I just do the thing of making lots of little puppets to keep me company. And that was some of what I did in the Magicians books, and really to some extent in all my books. That always happens.
Oh, I love that. And it's true. It is something that I think it's harder. I think the friendships maybe that you build as an adult are deeper, but they're more selective, and they might overlap in various circles, but it isn't that whole family group feeling where everyone has that connection together.
Yeah.
My friends, I do have friends, but they're not friends with each other. I don't know why not, but it just didn't work out that way. But I think so in the books, I get to make them be friends with each other.
Now you have all these friends in this book club, too.
That's right.
So
Everyone
here's some questions on YouTube. Oh gosh, where did it go? Okay, so Jeremy asks, is there any meaning behind the name Quentin Coldwater?
Quentin's definitely a resonant name. I think that a lot of people have drawn a connection between that and him and Quentin Compson in The Sound and the Fury by Faulkner, which I think is a legitimate connection. I'm a great lover of modernist literary modernism in general, and I'm sure that Quentin Compson bled over into Quentin Coldwater. In terms of his last name, I mean, I always love. There's something very appealing about names which are two nouns crammed together. And I remember experimenting with different ones. Quentin has a cold streak. When he wants to turn off his emotions about somebody, he really does. And I think that was an association of mine. And I'm sure there are others, but those are all the ones I can think of.
Okay.
So here's a little random question from book club member Dan Lafferty. He says, what was the motivation for break bills being behind regular New York time? It's a delightful quirk that doesn't necessarily seem necessary to the story, but it adds this magical flavor.
Yeah, it's. I think where did it come about? It came about for several reasons. I remember. I mean, this is how now you sort of get to see the sausage getting made. I remember wanting Quentin to come from being in the middle of the school year at home to the beginning of the school year in break bills. And how do you do that? Magic. That's right. It's magic. But I also remember that when Quentin and Elliot go rowing on the river, and they reach the kind of boundary between break bills time and regular time, and it's late summer, and then they cross the boundary, and it's sort of a drizzly November. I kind of fell in love with that image, and I wanted to build it into the world, and so I did.
So kind of to tie into that, AJ on YouTube asked, was there significance to setting the story in upstate New York? Is there a tie there? I mean, I know you're a New Yorker, but what's the significance behind that location?
I mean, the sort of the immediate reason was I started writing the book. I was house sitting for somebody in upstate New York, and that's where I happened to be, and I kept it there. I don't know. I liked the landscape. I liked that old. It's not technically New England, but I like that old New England kind of feeling that landscape has up there. It's one of those places. It was interesting setting the book in America because so much of fantasy comes out of Europe, and especially the UK, where you have much more of a sort of cultural continuity to the deep past. In America, it's not like that as much. But in some place like upstate New York, you certainly feel a connection to at least a few centuries ago because you can see the work that the farmers did on the landscape still.
So on Facebook, Julie asked, how involved were you with the show and how do you feel about it and any changes that inevitably occurred?
Well, it's a complicated question.
Yeah.
I didn't write a single word that went into the show. That said, I read every word. At the beginning of every season, we'd talk about the season arc, and then I'd look at outlines of each episode, and we'd talk about them, and then I'd see the script for each episode, and we'd talk about them. So it all crossed my desk. And I would sort of have opinions and make recommendations, and sometimes they follow them, and sometimes they wouldn't. But I didn't have any creative control really. So I was there, but I was sort of kibitzing. I wasn't really kind of on the scene. And it was funny when you're novels are one of these media where you don't have to collaborate very much. You really do. You do the characters, you do the dialogue, you do the sets, you do the lighting. Everything is you do it all by yourself. So it was definitely a new experience. Collaborating and watching other people write words for my characters and speak words for my characters. That was very new, and it was definitely an adjustment. But I came to really love it. And watch the creators take the characters to places that I never could have taken them. But they could, and it was really gratifying to watch it. And it was fun. It was fun also because writing is a very isolating thing. And you walk onto the set of a TV show that's based on your books, and everybody's your friend, and suddenly you have that magic circle of friends for like 2 days, and then you go home again. But that was really wonderful, and I became really good friends with some of the people involved with the show.
That's cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We have a question that kind of ties into that from Sarah Sanders. She says, did you ever feel like this world that you created is a part of who you are, and do you miss not being there when you don't get to write about it any longer?
Yeah, I do. It's funny. It's a complicated question because I think I alluded to the fact earlier that when I wrote The Magicians, it was at a time when I was really struggling with depression. It was in some ways a very dark time for me. There was some stuff going on for me personally that was really challenging. And a lot of the Magicians came out of that. I'm in a much better place kind of personally and with my mental health than I was back then. And so in some ways I feel very far away from the Magicians world and where it came from and the person who wrote it, which I started writing Magicians in 2004, so it was a long, long time ago for me. But I miss it. And I can't rule out the idea of ever coming back to it.
We've got a lot of questions about that.
But there's some other things I need to write first.
Yeah.
Would you say that you found writing The Magicians therapeutic as part of that process?
Yeah, it was therapeutic. It was really therapeutic. It was really therapeutic in ways that I still find kind of hard to talk about. But when you are depressed, the world feels very disenchanted. It feels very gray, and the meaning is all drained out of it. And for Quentin to discover that the world that he thought was completely mundane, that there is actually magic in it, it's a fairly obvious but still very powerful metaphor for that feeling of awakening out of depression and realizing that there is meaning in the world and that you hadn't known about it or you'd forgotten about it, but it's actually really real and all around you.
So how does it? This isn't in one of the questions, but kind of to that, how does it feel, knowing that this month about 2,000 or so people may have discovered your work for the first time? I had no idea. Being newer to all of this and being new to a book club, like I'd never heard of The Magicians before, and now I'm like, yeah, I'm going to read the whole trilogy. Like,
you quite literally created a magic for other people that we just got to all
discovered. So you wrote it in 2004, but here we are 16 years later talking about it, and we're in.
It's incredible. One of the sort of gifts I've had as a writer, and also curses, was I was very unsuccessful at it for a very long time, and I really, I always wanted to be a writer, and I started writing in college. And it wasn't really until I started The Magicians, which was when I was 35, that I really began to feel as though I was starting to find my voice as a writer. And I had been doing it for 15 years at that point, and it came out, by the time it came out, I was 40, and it was I'd been writing for 20 years. And then only then did people really feel like they were starting to connect to my work, and it's a miracle every time somebody reads a book of mine. I just will never ever get over how amazing it is.
That's awesome. Well, listen, Joe Kuykendall has a question. Jane Chatwin gave a brief explanation that she had failed many times to stop Martin before the events of the Magicians. Kind of a Doctor Strange scenario. What is a particularly fun or spectacular way that Martin managed to succeed and make it to Fillory?
Oh gosh. Martin, he's such a bastard, that guy. I would have a better answer to this if I hadn't had all the vodka before. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't have an answer off the top of my head. But you have to know that some really sick stuff went down in those other timelines. It's funny, something the show actually delved into a lot, and I didn't really in the books. But there's some pretty dark timelines.
I think Christy is the only one of the four of us who's actually watched the show.
Yeah,
so
I've seen it all. Yeah.
So I know everyone's asking a bunch of questions. I have a selfish question really quickly. What would your discipline be?
Oh gosh. What would it be? It's amazing that I haven't actually thought about that so much. I mean, you want it to be one of the like really superpower disciplines, where you're just like, yeah, my discipline is that I shoot lasers out of my eyes. That's just a crazy thing that I do with my magic. But I feel sure it would be something very, very small and meticulous. I know writers who are like great musicians and they can draw and they can sing and do amazing things. I only have one talent. And that is writing, which is mostly this very tiny moving around of little phrases on a computer. So I feel like it would be something really small and meticulous, I don't know, maybe something having to do with iron filings or something like that, and magnetism. It would happen on a very small scale.
So kind of speaking to your writing and writing process, Maria on YouTube asked, do you outline and do you also edit as you write, or just talk about that for just a second?
Yeah, I definitely outline. I always outline. I'm not much of an improviser, although I find that the best things that I write, it is the stuff that I improvise on the spot. But I need the the kind of the skeleton of an outline to work off of. That said, in the second book, there's a whole sort of half of the book basically becomes about Julia, who is a very minor character in The Magicians, and who actually was meant to be a one-off. She was meant to leave, at the very beginning of the book and never be seen again, and yet she sort of kept turning up throughout the book. When I went to write the second book, I outlined a book about Quentin, and I put in one chapter where Julia was going to just tell Julia's story and what had been going on with her this whole time. And once I started writing in her voice, it was so incredibly freeing and exciting that I ended up writing half the book, which did not appear anywhere in my outline. But it was all just sort of, it all came out of that one character in a way that I still can't explain. I've never had that experience before as a writer or since.
I got a good question for you on Facebook, again from my twin brother. He says there's often so much of a diaspora between the real world and the magical or fantastical world, and it's always interesting when the two are juxtaposed. Where have you found the feeling of experiencing magic in your life?
Such an interesting question. The number one answer. This is going to be such an uninteresting answer. The most magical thing that ever happens to me is writing. Magic is, and I find this to be the case for a lot of fantasy writers. Magic is a really powerful metaphor for artistic creation, and this feeling of it. energy coming from someplace inside you that you weren't aware of, and just forcing its way out of you in this really thrilling way. It's the most magic thing that I do. That said, I alluded to my tragically unfulfilled music career. It is astounding what happens when people play music together. That's an amazing thing. Those are probably the places. I'll tell you, because I'm being overly honest, I will also say that I am a truly avid tennis player. And there are moments when you're playing tennis and you're sort of improvising and things are happening really fast and you're doing things you didn't realize you could do. It is exciting in that way. I just want to retract that answer that I just gave. So pathetically mundane.
We'll cut that out of the podcast.
Yeah, right. Can you fix that in post?
That'll be the headline. Actually, we'll change the title.
So we have a very specific question from Christy Dishman. She says, was Jane Chatwin the entity in the fountain that manipulated Emily Greenstreet? I've wondered for ages.
Oh, that's a terrible thought. Jane is so much more benign than that terrible, terrible presence on the other side of that interaction. I'm 98% sure that wasn't Jane.
That's actually great to know.
I'm going to check in with her after we have this conversation, just to be sure. But I'd really like to think and hope that it wasn't Jane.
That's actually great insight for the entire club, because something that came up in our discussion this past Wednesday was how hands-on was Jane? How much did she manipulate to make sure that this is the end result that happened after so many trials and errors? So that's good for everybody who in the group chat this past Wednesday was thinking, how many strings did she pull?
Yeah. I got a question on YouTube from Austin Bachelor. What was the most difficult part in creating a magical world?
Let's see. It's a good question, and there's a few different answers to it. One is that when everybody has had this experience, and to some extent, I think writing science fiction, you have the same thing with advanced technology. You want magic to be powerful and pervasive and to have a lot of different cool applications, and yet you also want it not to break your plot. Your plot has to be made out of problems that can't be solved by magic. So you're constantly doing a little balancing act, and you'll be writing, and you'll sort of a challenge will face the characters, and then you'll think, oh no, but they did a spell earlier that would completely make that no problem, and then so you have to go back and fix magic back there to make sure it doesn't destroy your plot up there. That balancing act was tricky, definitely. And I think the other part of it is describing it. Magic, there's such an abundance of verbal cliches around magic. People have been describing for magic, so much that it starts to feel unmagical. And so you feel like you have to try to find new ways to describe it, new words to fit to it, to make it feel real again. I can remember reading Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, which came out in 2004, not coincidentally, the year that I started writing Magicians, because when I read that, I sort of woke up to magic again in this incredible way, because the way she describes it, it's like it's being done right in front of you. And I thought, oh my God, I didn't realize that was possible. So it was something that I worked hard on in The Magicians.
Awesome.
Here's a question from Sarah on Facebook. And I think you've kind of touched on some of this, but this gets a little specific. Where did you get the inspiration for building Fillory? For example, what inspired Castle Whitespire and the dark world beneath, the ecstasy in the air, the creatures and the plants in the world?
Obviously, Narnia fed into it. Definitely. That was part of it. Narnia is a maddening thing to writers of fantasy, because it feels so real, it's so powerful, and yet, at least in sort of by today's standards, it's not a great piece of world building. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense. It's got no working economy or ecology. The mythology is just super incoherent. It's got satyrs and it's got Santa Claus and Jesus Lion. I mean, it's an absolute mess. It just doesn't. And it just Mrs. Beaver has a sewing machine, but everybody else's technology is basically in sort of 14th century. So it's a real sort of. So I to some extent Fillory was an attempt to write a kind of rationalized Narnia that was more constrained by modern ideas of world building and continuity, and then the Castle Whitespire and its dark twin were probably inspired by Roger Zelazny. I don't know if any of you guys have read the Amber books. Those who have will recognize that I nicked something from those books that went into Castle Whitespire. And part of it is just that magical land that you wish was real and that you wish you were in. A lot of it just came from there.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to send you a T-shirt that says Jesus Lion with a big lion on it. So there you go.
So Dave Chapman asks, there are a few references in the books to tabletop role-playing games like Magic Missile and Free Trader Beowulf.
Yeah.
Were or are you a tabletop gamer? Has that inspired your writing? And have you considered a tabletop RPG based on the Magicians?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
It's a few different questions.
Yeah, sorry.
In one. I don't think that I'm alone in this for writers of my generation, that Dungeons and Dragons is a massive, unacknowledged literary formative experience. I think for a ton of writers, and I'm sure for me in particular, a lot of the Magicians was trying to write about magic in using some of the conventions of literary realism, trying to write about magic in the way that Hemingway would write about a chair or something like that. And the work that they did with Dungeons and Dragons of taking the sort of formless, messy, organic stuff of myth and kind of pushing it into a system that felt real and that was governed by probabilities. Having grown up kind of watching that happen and playing with that system, it was just unbelievably useful. And I couldn't resist calling it out in the book, partly because it was fun and partly because I felt like people who went to magic school would definitely have played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. There's just on the level of just plausibility, that's who would end up at a school for magic. And the Free Trader Beowulf thing, which comes in The Magician King, is a reference to Traveler, a beloved, although I think sort of more of a culty kind of space opera game, which I played when I was a kid. And I've talked to a lot of people about doing a Magicians RPG, and while the show was going on, it became a thorny legal question. Now that the show is wrapped up, it's a little bit more open. So I've talked to a lot of people about it, and for some reason, the stars have not yet aligned, but I'm still sort of hoping that they will.
That's awesome.
Let's say, don't you know someone who has a hand in designing video games?
Yeah, you've had a lot of experience with video games in your past, right?
As a player of them, yes, definitely.
Yes.
And my brother, Austin, has a career as a game designer. So.
Oh, awesome. Well, Adam and I are huge gamers. We are huge geeks. And I really appreciated, and I chuckled out loud when you said Wizard needs food badly, because I was like, Gauntlet! That's a Gauntlet reference! He's one of me! I'm him! So I
my game references are mostly really dated, because I gave up hardcore gaming when I started having kids because something had to go. But boy, that was a big part of my life, especially kind of the early shooters like Quake and Doom and Marathon. That was a big part of my life, which I miss. And then Halo, I was sort of just there for the early days of Halo.
Right. Awesome.
Jenny Jones on Facebook is asking, are there any deleted scenes from The Magicians?
Not a lot from The Magicians. Or, I say that, and I wonder if I went back, would I find some? There probably are. There probably are. One big deleted scene wound up in Magician King, so it got undeleted. There's a scene with a dragon in Magician King, which was got cut from the Magicians, and I was so mad that I was like, my editor was like, this scene makes no sense and it doesn't advance the plot in any way. And I was like, look, but there's a dragon. And she was like, I don't think so. And I was like, what book ever got better by cutting the dragon out of it? But we cut the dragon out of it. But then it made it into The Magician King. There's definitely quite a bit of cut material from the third book, which I ended up kind of cutting the whole sort of first third of it and then having to rewrite it. And some of those are online. I think they're kicking around somewhere. And they're very fun. There's some stuff in there that I'm really proud of and was sad to cut. The Magicians, I should go back and see what's on the cutting room floor deep in my hard drive somewhere.
We have a couple of questions kind of in that same vein, both from Charlene Tissel and Jennifer. Ooh, Jennifer Liguori. Or maybe that might be your name.
Liguori.
Sorry.
Liguori.
She says, what would you have not written if you'd known this was going to be a trilogy? And Charlene similarly says, looking back, if you could change anything about a character, what would you change, after the fact? So after you completed this trilogy, what were those things that you might have changed for the Magicians?
I feel like I'm going to say something that authors aren't supposed to say. I feel like authors are supposed to say, but my books are perfect. But of course they're not. And having lived with them for so long, there are things I think about. There are, there's definitely some egregious continuity errors in Magicians, some of which I've had fixed by the publisher and some of which I think are still out there. But we're not going to dwell on those. I definitely felt that towards the end of the Magicians, should I really say this out loud? I'm just going to say it. Quentin got overpowered. He got too good. He became too skilled a magician, and his power ramped up so high that it made it challenging to go back and make and write the second and third books. And in fact, at the beginning of the second book, you're meant to understand that he has been really lazy and letting his skills atrophy for like 2 or 3 years because his skills were really inconvenient for me as an author.
So you created your own problem.
I did. Sorry, my life. Let's see what else is there. There's the question. There's the lingering question of Quentin and his likability, his undeniable narcissism, and whether it's not. I think it's not a problem to have characters who are narcissistic or insensitive, but generally you want to make them pay a price for it. Did Quentin pay enough of a price for it? Did people put up with him more than they should have? Because he can be really annoying. And it's something that I didn't think very much about when I was writing it. I thought, I'm going to try to portray somebody who is struggling with these kinds of mental health issues, who's fundamentally a good person and quite bright. But, when you are depressed, depression and narcissism are intimately linked. When you are depressed, you tend to become very focused on yourself, even though you hate yourself, because it's just hard you're putting so much energy into just maintaining and keeping yourself together. You don't pay as much attention to other people's needs as you should. And that's something that's true of, that's been true of me in my life. And it's definitely been true. It's definitely true of Quentin. Do I wish I'd gone back and either straightened him out some or made him pay a higher price? Probably I should have. But it's too late. It's too late. I hoped to try to correct some of that in the later books.
So this was an early question, kind of around Quentin from Evelyn. When did you first conceive Quentin as a character, and was maybe that after hearing, was that maybe a reflection of what you were going through as a writer at that period, or I'll let you take that.
Yeah, I mean, it's much more a reflection of what I went through when I was 17, and really, really even if you can imagine, even less self-aware than I was at the age of 35 when I wrote The Magicians. That's what Quentin comes out of. He also comes out of, thinking about, a massive influence on The Magicians was Watchmen. That was a really formative book for me. And, one of the things that Alan Moore did was try to think hard about what kinds of people would actually become superheroes. Who would actually put on tights and go out and beat up muggers? It would be people who are psychopaths and have substance abuse problems and are narcissists and megalomaniacs. And part of it was thinking about who, if there was really a school for magic, who would go. And I decided that a large part of the student body would be massive nerds, like myself, who read a lot of fantasy. And also struggled with a lot of the emotional problems that people often turn to fantasy literature to help with. And I think that's, somewhere in there is where Quentin came out of.
Very good.
So what are you working on and what can we expect from you next?
What's funny, Magician's Land came out in 2014, and I have been writing a lot since then. While I was writing The Magicians, and even for a year or two afterwards, I had a day job. I was working full time.
Wow.
And I was finally able to quit and write fiction full time. I think 3 years ago. And so I've been writing a lot, and it's only starting to surface now. All the stuff that I've been working on. I wrote a movie, which we shot most of this spring, although production shut down for the coronavirus. Hopefully we will finish that up, and the movie will come out on Amazon Prime sometime toward the end of the year, we hope.
Awesome.
In September. Wait.
Wait.
Oh, there it is.
Oh, how convenient.
There it is.
I wrote a novel, which is, I guess you'd call it a middle grade novel, which was sort of, if you could imagine, my shirt is
They're loving it.
Our numbers
it,
just went up for some reason. I was wondering why that was.
As we speak,
I'm just going to keep this here. I have kids, and I spend a lot of time telling them stories and reading them stories, and eventually a story that I told them turned into a book, which is coming out. It's called The Silver Arrow. It's coming out in September.
Awesome.
And I feel really excited about that. I just today turned in a screenplay for a movie based on a popular video game, which I probably shouldn't say what it is.
Okay.
So, hopefully a lot of scripts get written and movies don't get made, but
I'll make it.
Somebody paid a lot of money for the rights to that video game. So I'm hoping that they'll make the movie, and that would be exciting. I'm working on a TV show with the Russo brothers, the guys who did the Avengers movies.
We've heard of them.
And that's in development at Amazon. And that will be super exciting if it ever happens. But boy, it's taking a long time to sort of work its way through development. Probably the thing I have devoted the most time to in the past 6 years is a novel about King Arthur, which is very long, and I've written it and rewritten it several times at this point, and I'm still not totally satisfied with it. But I'm hoping that this draft will be the last draft, and that will come out next year. And it's called The Bright Sword.
Awesome.
It sounds like you got a lot of really awesome things coming up.
We're going to look out for all of that stuff.
Real quick, I have a comment from someone who actually says, as a licensed therapist, I read, watched, and fell in love with the Magicians to escape. Ironically, connecting with a community of Magicians lovers over the last 5 years of the show, I'm seeing a different perspective. It was never about mental health for me, since I'm deeply enmeshed daily with severe mental illness in the real world. Perhaps that is why I'm drawn to it. And I do want to say so many of our book club members have come forward in this chat and said, thank you so much for being so open, so honest about mental health. This is an issue that touches so many people's lives. And I think everyone is just incredibly grateful for you talking about it and giving us all a piece of magic that really stemmed from that.
Yeah, for sure. So we are nearing the hour mark, but I've got a couple of. We can do one more question. I got some rapid fire, this or that type stuff.
Ooh, rapid.
So when I was looking you up, learning all about you, everything.
That's not creepy.
One of the things that you were quoted as saying is, fantasy is sometimes dismissed as childish or escapist, but I take what I'm doing very seriously. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. I think there was definitely a time when I felt defensive about being a fantasy writer, and I think it's because it has to do, I think, with my background. I came from a very literary family. My parents were both English professors, and I honestly felt defensive about having written fantasy because I felt like it gets short shrift sometimes. People don't consider it respectable. I think that has changed a lot. A lot, in the past 10 years or so, to the point where it's sort of unbecoming of me to kind of accuse people of not taking it seriously. I think a lot of people do take it very seriously. But it is interesting. I mean, literary realism has been kind of the dominant mode of the novel for a long, long time. If you look, if you go back past, 1700 or so, there's so much more fantasy in what is considered to be high literature. Shakespeare has so much fantasy in it, and Spencer and Milton and Dante and Homer, monsters and magic and everything are so central to world literature. And then there is this funny thing where when the modern novel kind of gets born, that stuff gets a little bit pushed into the Gothic, into fairy tales for children. It becomes less central, which I think is very interesting and a kind of underexamined fact. And I think the pendulum's kind of swinging back the other way, and people are re-embracing fantasy and science fiction, which is great. But I was kind of defensive about it for a while.
Yeah.
Well, that's, I mean, because the reason I ask is, as somebody who makes comedy, and people think that I just goof off all the time, but there's even in these genres like fantasy and comedy, like you have to take it very seriously, and
they require a lot of discipline and a lot of honesty. Fantasy demands of you a lot of emotional openness in a way that is challenging and difficult.
All right. Well, before we wrap it up, I just got a few, and if y'all think of some rapid fire this or that type of questions, because we're all sort of sci-fi fantasy nerds. Star Wars or Star Trek?
Star Wars.
Oh, that was
yes.
Take it, Adam.
Hang on,
Take it.
you answered a little too quickly on that one. If you want to take some time and think about it, we got a few more minutes.
I like Star Trek. I was a big next generation person, but I know where my heart lies.
Okay, well you're wrong, but Marvel or DC?
Marvel.
I can.
This is rapid fire, right? I'm just
can agree with you on
Yeah,
that.
you're right.
Harry Potter or Chronicles of Narnia?
Don't make me choose.
So yeah,
It's like
softened you up.
fighting.
Softened you up with the softballs, and then
I grew up on Narnia. I mean, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was sort of the beginning of everything for me. So I guess I got to go with Chronicles of Narnia.
Okay. Star Wars or Star Trek? We can go back to that one. If you want.
This will play to your
final answer.
Your video game, Sega or Nintendo?
Oh, Atari is the answer. I mean,
Okay,
you got to take into account how old I actually am.
You're 2600. That's totally legit.
That was my console. That was my console, and the Apple IIe was my really starting gaming platform. So there have been since.
I'm feeling a little guilty though, because you did mention you're like, yes, we had children, the video games had to go, and I was like, oh no, don't show him our basement.
Yeah.
One day they'll come back. One
They'll
day.
come back.
Yeah, like King Arthur, they'll return.
Well, Lev, where can people find you and find out more about your works and follow you on social media? Tell us where we can find you.
I'm on Twitter more than I ought to be. My Twitter handle is Leverus, which is a Severus Snape allusion. When you pick your Twitter handle, you're in the moment, and it just whatever feels natural. That's what felt natural at that moment. I'm on Twitter too much. I'm occasionally on Facebook, even sometimes on Instagram, and my handles there are obvious and intuitive, so it's not very hard to find me. And I have a website and a blog, which I update once a year. So you can always check in on that.
Excellent.
Well, that about wraps it up for the Q&A. Sorry if we weren't able to get to y'all's questions. You had so many good ones, and we tried to get to as many as we could. But big, huge thank you to Lev Grossman for joining us tonight. We can't thank you enough for gracing us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Our book club members are responding very positively to this, and I think people are going to read your trilogy now, and including us. So
it's an honor. It's an honor to be read. I'm grateful. Thank you.
Well, that wraps it up, and so we'll have more news about more fun stuff coming up later. But for now, good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.